So glad you're back with us for another GoldSeek Radio Nugget segment. Today's special guest, James Turk, founder of Gold Money and author of The Dollar Collapse. It's a pleasure to welcome back James Turk to the program to discuss precious metals and related economic trends. James Turk is founder of Gold Money and co-author of The Collapse of the Dollar and How to Profit from It. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Chris.
You know, I'd like to begin the discussion, if we could, on an interesting book, 1974, titled Dying of Money by Genzo Parsons. For many of us in the gold crowd, this is part of our library. I have a copy. According to Ambrose Evans Pritchard this morning, elite financiers, bankers, and economists in Europe are suddenly scrambling for a copy of this book, James. And would you believe it's selling right now for $750 on Amazon.com?
Yeah, I read that article. I couldn't believe it. I was tempted to get my copy and put it up for... It would leave a hole in my library, so I decided not to.
On eBay, there's an unlimited number of brand new copies for $34, so I hope folks don't run out and spend, between $200 and $700 on those original editions, unless you're just so inclined. But, Genzo Parsons says, James, that inflation is as old as mankind and money itself. He refers to it as a disease. And most of us think of the French Revolution, Weimar Republic, American Civil War, and, of course, the 70s here in the U.S. when we think of inflation. But he takes us back to 300 A.D. when the Roman emperor there replaced silver coins with copper slugs. Even the penalty of death wasn't enough to convince people to fix prices. Do you see something similar coming this way? Or are they going to just keep fighting this with everything they have in their arsenal?
Yeah, I think history should be listened to here. There's always a propensity to create too much money in the hope that you can get away with it or that nobody will notice, as Parsons points out in his book. But eventually the market does notice. People do understand that too much money is being printed. Inflation occurs, in some cases hyperinflation occurs. Given that there is no external discipline on the dollar, as there used to be when it was defined as a weight of gold or a weight of silver, in the absence of that external discipline, the U.S. government can print as much money as it wants. The Federal Reserve is there to give the U.S. government all the dollars it wants, all the dollars that politicians want to spend, and that's what we're seeing happen. So I think the consequence of all of this is that we are going to go into a hyperinflation, and that will ultimately collapse the dollar. Just like the Continental, the first currency of this country, collapsed in a hyperinflation. It
sure did. And Southern States currency as well followed the collapse of the Continental. And even the greenback lost, some sources say, 80 to 100% of its value. So prices would have doubled. Next, Parsons points out that every hyperinflation began what he terms a mildly annoying period of inflation. And that subsequently that erupts into a volcano of higher prices. It also sounds similar, doesn't it, James?
Yeah, it really does. And it gets to the heart of the matter. We always talk about the supply of money, but we really don't give much attention to the demand for money. And the demand is equally important. And there are two elements that come into play. In an inflation, you can lose purchasing power. Prices can go up if the supply of money increases at a rate too fast or a rate faster than the demand for money. But the other thing that happens is that the demand for money can actually fall. If people lose confidence in the ability of that currency to maintain its purchasing power, they will sell that currency in exchange for other monies, for gold, and in the case of a hyperinflation, even for goods or services. Because at the end of the day, if you own a pound of copper, that has usefulness. If you own a dozen eggs, that has usefulness, whereas paper money in a hyperinflation loses its usefulness at every moment because of the lack of stability, the erosion of its purchasing power.
Exactly. The fiat currency, the very definition is the faith of those that use it. And when they lose that faith, there goes the value of the currency.
Exactly. And when they lose it, that's the tipping point. And monetary history shows that when that tipping point is reached, you normally have 6 to 9 months before the currency collapses completely.
We're going to get into that a little bit later in this discussion. I'd like to talk a little bit more about how quickly things sort of fomented in the Weimar situation, which he really focuses on. But next, Parsons says that in every inflationary event, it was up to each and every individual person to educate themselves and to prepare because no one else was looking out for them. Once again, eerily familiar.
Yeah, that's a good point of Parsons' book as well. At the end of the day, it's really self-reliance. We really have to rely on our own wits, our own intuition, our own savings. We can't rely on the government to solve problems, just like poor people who were in New Orleans who relied on the government in the aftermath of Katrina. They learned the consequences of relying on government. It's self-reliance is I think, going to become increasingly important, and people who are prepared for whatever might come. And let's hope that we don't get hyperinflation, but I do expect it. But if you're prepared for it, you can deal with it.
James, that's not a very sexy thing, I think, to throw out there, this word self-reliance. It almost reminds one of Ronald Reagan's rugged individual. But at the end of the day, that's what's required. And there is something to be said about the satisfaction that anyone can accomplish. I mean, we see many immigrants come to this country. This is sort of a success story that's been repeated through time immemorial. I mean, we've seen immigrants, many of us in our families have immigrants who came to this country with very little, not much more than they had in their pockets. And within, a year or two or three, we're doing quite well. Even folks who find themselves in difficult times today with the recession, 9.5% rate of unemployment, foreclosures rampant and with no end in sight, there are ways to cut costs and expenses and sort of grasp what you were referring to there, and that's that self-reliance.
Yeah, and I think it's self-reliance or rugged individualism or however you want to describe it. I think that was an important component that made the United States, what it was. It created the wealth in the United States, enabled the United States to grow. I myself am a first-generation American. My father was born in Europe. And, I learned, as he did, the importance of self-reliance, saving for that rainy day and everything that goes along with it. And unfortunately, I think that message has been lost, particularly in the last couple of decades. And when I look and see that today, 58% of the population in the United States depends on a government check at some level, be it state government, local government, working for the military or whatever. 58% of the population relying to some extent on a government check. Is there really self-reliance in that kind of environment? It makes me worry as to what's going to happen if we do go this hyperinflationary route. And, that's clearly the way we're headed because of all of the money printing from the Federal Reserve.
It almost seems as though we're setting up a culture of reliance, which in and of itself sort of becomes a perpetuating cycle downward.
Yeah, and there's another issue related to that too, Chris, is that, everybody, if there's a problem that arises, people say, well, let the government solve it. But, government basically is the problem. You have to turn to the free market to solve the problems. It's the free market that creates wealth. It's the free market that raises everybody's standard of living. At best, governments just rearrange wealth or redistribute it. At worst, they actually destroy it. But, we have to look to the free market for various solutions. And unfortunately, very few people are doing that today.
I think it ties in so well with another guest on our show here occasionally, and that's Mr. Steve Forbes. He penned an excellent book, How Capitalism Will Save Us. I have a copy right here in the office, and it really is a remarkable treatise covering everything we've been discussing for the most part so far. This nonsense that free markets are the problem is so upside down, it's laughable.
Yeah, I agree.